In 1902, a British excavation team led by archaeologist John Garstang was working a limestone hillside 265 kilometers south of Cairo. They pried open a rock-cut tomb carved into the cliff face and found a body curled inside a ceramic pot, knees drawn to the chest, sealed in darkness for nearly 5,000 years. No gold, no amulets, no painted sarcophagus. Just a man in a jar, with pottery shards around him suggesting he might have made them himself. They catalogued it, crated it, and shipped it to Liverpool. For over a century, nobody sequenced a single nucleotide from those bones. The pot survived 2 world wars. It survived German bombing raids that hit Liverpool during the Blitz. And it survived something even more destructive than bombs: indifference. Because for most of the 20th century, the scientific consensus was clear. DNA from ancient Egypt was unrecoverable. The heat had destroyed it. The chemistry had erased it. There was nothing left to read. That consensus was not just wrong, it was hiding something that would eventually rearrange our understanding of who the ancient Egyptians actually were and who their descendants are today. Here is a fact that most people accept without examining it. Egypt sits in Africa. Egyptians today are African. Therefore, the thinking goes, ancient and modern Egyptians must be more or less the same population, shaped by the same geography, drinking from the same Nile, burying their dead in the same sand. Continuity feels obvious. It feels inevitable. For most of the 20th century, that assumption went largely untested, not because nobody cared, but because nobody could test it. The genetic tools did not exist, and by the time they did, the material seemed to have expired. The obstacle was the DNA itself. Imagine opening a sealed tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The air inside is over 40 degrees Celsius. The stone walls weep moisture, and every surface of the body inside has been packed in natron, a caustic salt that strips water from flesh, the way bleach strips color from cloth. Each of those 3 forces destroys DNA in a different way. Heat snaps the phosphodiester bonds that hold the double helix together. Think of it as the rungs of a ladder splintering from the inside. Humidity attacks the base pairs directly, shredding the genetic code letter by letter. And the natron that preserved the linen and skin so beautifully? It dissolved the very molecules that encoded who this person was, where they came from, and who their parents had been. Put those 3 forces together for 3,000 years, and you get genetic material so fragmented, so contaminated by bacteria and fungi, that extracting a human signal becomes like trying to reconstruct a shredded letter from a bonfire. Svante Pääbo, then a 29-year-old graduate student at Uppsala in Sweden, tried first. In 1985, working secretly at night, afraid his thesis advisor would shut the project down, he extracted genetic material from a 2,400-year-old mummy of a child and published it in Nature. It was the first ancient human DNA ever reported from any source. The paper made global headlines, and it was almost certainly wrong. Pääbo himself later acknowledged that the sequences could not be authenticated. The method he used, polymerase chain reaction, was powerful but indiscriminate. It amplified whatever DNA was present in the sample, and there was no way to distinguish ancient fragments from modern contamination. The sequences may have been his own skin cells. He went on to sequence the Neanderthal genome, discover the Denisovans, and win the 2022 Nobel Prize. But for Egyptian mummy genetics, his early work became a cautionary tale, not a foundation. By the 2000s, prominent voices in the ancient DNA community were openly questioning whether recoverable DNA from Egyptian remains was even physically possible. That wall stood for 30 years. What brought it down was not a better mummy. It was a better way of reading damage. The breakthrough arrived not from better mummies, but from better machines. By the mid-2010s, a technology called next-generation sequencing had matured enough to read millions of DNA fragments simultaneously, including fragments as short as 30 or 40 base pairs, lengths that older methods would have discarded as noise. But the real game changer was something subtler. Researchers had learned to read the scars that time leaves on ancient DNA. Here is how it works. When DNA sits in a sample for centuries, certain nucleotides undergo chemical changes. Cytosine bases lose their amino groups and become uracil, a molecule that does not normally appear in DNA at all. This damage accumulates in predictable patterns, concentrated at the ends of each fragment. Modern contamination, from a researcher's breath, from a storage box, from a museum visitor who touched the specimen in 1890, does not carry these patterns. For the first time, you could look at a genetic sequence and know whether it was 3,000 years old or 3 days old. Johannes Krauss, a geneticist at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena, Germany, saw the opening. He had already used these methods to identify the pathogen behind the Black Death from medieval plague victims. Now he turned to Egypt. He and a team, led by Verena Schuenemann, a paleogeneticist at the University of Tübingen, focused on a collection that had been sitting in German institutions since the early 20th century. 151 mummified heads from Abusir el-Meleq, a settlement about 100 kilometers south of Cairo. The site had served as a burial ground devoted to Osiris, god of the dead, making it a popular cemetery for centuries. These were not royalty. These were not pharaohs in gilded sarcophagi. These were ordinary, middle-class people buried in painted wooden coffins. And the team made a critical discovery about where in the body to look. Previous studies had focused on mummified soft tissue, skin, muscle, organs. The tissue looked preserved. It was visually dramatic. And it was almost completely stripped of usable DNA. Schuenemann's team found that bones and teeth, protected inside the body, insulated from embalming chemicals, less exposed to heat, preserved genetic material far better. Specifically, the petrous bone behind the ear and the dental cementum that anchors teeth into the jaw turned out to be the last strongholds of ancient DNA in an otherwise hostile environment. The strongholds proved invaluable. From 151 individuals, radiocarbon dated across a span of 1,300 years, from the New Kingdom around 1400 BCE through the Greek and Roman occupations to about 400 CE, they recovered 90 mitochondrial genomes and extracted genome-wide nuclear data from 3 individuals. The authentication tests were rigorous. The damage patterns checked out. This was real. And when they ran the comparisons, the results overthrew something fundamental. The ancient Egyptians of Abusir el-Meleq were genetically closest to ancient populations from the Near East and the Levant, not sub-Saharan Africa, not the Mediterranean coast. The Levant, the region encompassing modern-day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And this affinity was stable. Across 1,300 years of foreign conquest, Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the genetics of this community barely shifted. Wolfgang Hock, one of the researchers, put it bluntly. The population remained genetically unaffected by foreign conquest and rule. Conquest did not mean replacement. Foreign rulers came and went. The DNA stayed. But then something changed. And the change did not happen when anyone expected it to. When the team compared their ancient samples to 135 modern Egyptians, a gap opened up. The ancient individuals carried between 6 and 15% sub-Saharan African ancestry. The modern Egyptians carried between 14 and 21%. That is roughly an 8% increase in the sub-Saharan component, and it appeared to have arrived after the Roman period, not during the great conquests of antiquity. Sit with that for a moment. The Persians conquered Egypt in 525 BCE and ruled it for over a century. No measurable genetic impact. Alexander the Great took it in 332 BCE, and his successors held it for 300 years. No measurable genetic impact. Rome absorbed it in 30 BCE and governed it for 4 centuries. No measurable genetic impact. But something that happened in the centuries after Rome, something quieter, slower, undramatic, rewrote a significant portion of the Egyptian genome. If you have been watching this channel, you know we keep circling the same theme. The events that transform populations are almost never the ones that get the grand narratives. The dramatic conquests get the chapters. The slow, undocumented migrations get the genes. This is one of those stories. And it took 40 years, from Pabo's contaminated mummy sequences to the first authenticated ancient Egyptian genomes, for the science to catch up. If that kind of long arc discovery is what you come here for, subscribing is the single best way to make sure you do not miss what comes next. So what happened after Rome? The Schuenemann team pointed to two converging forces. First, the trans-Saharan slave trade, which existed in some form from antiquity, but intensified dramatically after the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE. Over the next 1,250 years, an estimated 6 to 7 million sub-Saharan Africans were forcibly moved to North Africa, with the trade peaking in the 19th century. Cairo was one of the principal slave markets. The Nile Valley was one of the primary corridors. And unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which has been extensively studied, the trans-Saharan routes left fewer written records but moved a comparable number of people over a far longer period. Second, increased long-distance mobility along the Nile itself, trade networks, seasonal migration, intermarriage between Egyptian and Nubian communities. Throughout pharaonic history, the boundary between Egypt and Nubia was permeable. Egyptian men married Nubian women, and vice versa. Archaeological evidence shows ethnic complexity within individual households. But in the Islamic period, these movements accelerated, and the geographic reach extended deeper into sub-Saharan Africa. The Arab conquest itself also brought new genetic material from the Arabian Peninsula. Nomadic Bedouin groups, Levantine Arabs, and Arabized populations from Western Asia settled in Egypt over centuries. This was not a single migration event, but a prolonged demographic process that reshaped the genetic landscape gradually. Studies of Y chromosomal haplogroups in modern Egypt show markers associated with Arabian Peninsula origins alongside the indigenous North African and Near Eastern lineages. These were not invasions recorded in royal inscriptions. They were demographic currents, operating across centuries, leaving no monuments, no victory stelae, no temple reliefs. But they left an unmistakable genetic signature that modern sequencing can now detect. The 2017 study was a landmark, the first demonstration that ancient Egyptian mummies could yield reliable DNA, and the first measurement of a genetic discontinuity between ancient and modern populations. But it had a limitation that the authors themselves acknowledged openly, and that their critics would sharpen into something more pointed. Every mummy in the study came from one site. 1. Abusir el-Meleq in Middle Egypt. And the oldest samples dated only to the New Kingdom, roughly 1400 BCE. That is already 2,000 years into dynastic history. What about the people who built the first pyramids? What about Upper Egypt, hundreds of kilometers to the south, geographically closer to Nubia, where sub-Saharan ancestry might have been substantially higher, even in deep antiquity? What about the Delta, the Mediterranean coast, the oases, each with its own migration corridors and population dynamics? Biological anthropologist S.O.Y. Keita argued in 2022 that the study overgeneralized from a geographically narrow dataset, and that using West African Yoruba as a proxy for all sub-Saharan ancestry was too blunt an instrument. It could mask contributions from East African or Nilotic populations that might have been present in Egypt since prehistory. Linguist Christopher Ehret went further, criticizing the sample sizes as insufficient and the interpretation as biased, pointing to paternal haplogroups of clear African origin, like EM35, which has deep roots in Northeast Africa, that predated any slave trade by thousands of years. And in 2025, scholars Augustine Hall and Jean-Philippe Gourdin, writing for UNESCO's General History of Africa, pushed back more directly. They argued that identifiable African genetic markers in ancient Egyptian samples preceded the trans-Saharan trade and could not be attributed solely to recent admixture. The sub-Saharan component, they maintained, was not an intrusion, it was part of the original substrate. Gourdin also pointed to STR analysis of the Amarna royal mummies, which found strong affinities with modern sub-Saharan populations in some measurements, a result that sits uncomfortably alongside the Schuenemann findings. These are not fringe objections. They are methodological critiques from credentialed researchers within the field, and they point to something real. A single burial ground in Middle Egypt cannot speak for all of ancient Egypt, any more than a single cemetery in Manchester could speak for all of medieval England. But here is where the story takes another turn. Because in 2025, someone finally cracked the genome that everyone had been waiting for. The body in the ceramic pot, the one excavated from Nuwayrat in 1902, shipped to Liverpool, stored through a century of neglect, turned out to hold the oldest sequenceable Egyptian DNA ever recovered. Pontus Skoglund, a paleogeneticist at the Francis Crick Institute in London, led the study alongside Adeline Moores-Jacobs from Liverpool John Moores University. Skoglund admitted his expectations were low going in. Mummified tissue fails almost every time. But this individual had not been mummified. He had been buried before artificial mummification became standard practice, sealed inside a ceramic pot inside a rock-cut tomb, conditions that created a stable, dry microenvironment far more favorable to DNA preservation than natron-soaked linen wrappings. They extracted DNA from the cementum of a single tooth root, the dense tissue that locks a tooth into the jaw, and one of the last places in the human body where DNA degrades. Of 7 extracts, only 2 preserved enough material to sequence. The coverage was low, about 2 times the genome, but the authentication was airtight. The cytosine to uracil damage patterns matched exactly what ancient DNA should look like. No contamination. The man was radiocarbon dated to between 2855 BCE and 2570 BCE. That places him at the boundary between the early dynastic period and the Old Kingdom, the Age of Pyramids. He lived during or shortly after the construction of the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, when Upper and Lower Egypt had only recently been unified under a single ruler. His skeleton told its own story. Severe osteoarthritis in the cervical vertebrae, expanded ischial tuberosities, the sit bones, enlarged from years of squatting, evidence of repetitive arm movements suggesting daily manual labor. Joel Irish, the Liverpool bioarchaeologist who examined him, estimated he died between 44 and 64 years of age after decades of physical work, possibly as a potter. Forensic anthropologist Caroline Wilkinson reconstructed his face from a 3-dimensional scan of his skull. The phenotype analysis predicted brown eyes with nearly 99% probability, brown hair, and skin pigmentation ranging from dark to black, features broadly consistent with present-day Egyptians and North Africans. And his genome told a different kind of story entirely. Approximately 80% of his ancestry mapped to North African Neolithic populations, the indigenous genetic baseline of the region, closely related to groups who had lived in the Maghreb for thousands of years before the first pharaoh. The remaining roughly 20% traced not to the Levant, not to Europe, not to sub-Saharan Africa, but to the eastern Fertile Crescent, specifically to ancient populations from Mesopotamia and its surrounding regions. 3 things follow from this, and each one matters. First, what the evidence shows. Genetic connections between Egypt and Mesopotamia were not merely cultural, not just traded pottery styles, shared agricultural innovations, or borrowed writing systems moving along trade routes. Actual people moved. Mesopotamian ancestry was physically present in the Egyptian gene pool by the time the pyramids were going up. Yahya Gad, scientific supervisor of the ancient DNA lab at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, described the finding as reinforcing Egypt's status as a crossroads and melting pot of the ancient world. Second, what it rules out. This was not a population that arrived recently from sub-Saharan Africa, nor one primarily European or Anatolian in composition. The deep ancestry was North African, with a Mesopotamian overlay, a profile entirely consistent with Egypt's geographic position at the hinge between Africa and Western Asia. The study explicitly excluded any substantial ancestry related to ancient hunter-gatherers from Ethiopia or other populations in Central, Eastern, or Southern Africa. Third, what it implies about everything that happened afterward. When the team reanalyzed the Third Intermediate Period mummies from Abusir el-Meleq using the Nuwayrat genome as a new baseline, the ancestry composition had shifted dramatically. The Bronze Age Levantine component had surged to roughly 64% in some models, with Mesopotamian ancestry at 18% and a Moroccan-type North African component at 36%. That shift aligns chronologically with the Hyksos invasion, the end of the Middle Kingdom, and the massive population movements of the Late Bronze Age collapse. Egypt's gene pool was being reshaped not by one event, but by a series of demographic waves, each leaving its own signature, each invisible until someone had the tools to read it. What makes this picture so contested is that it touches on identity. And identity, in Egypt, is not an abstraction. Modern Egyptians, Muslim and Christian alike, share the vast majority of their ancestry with these ancient populations. Genetic modeling from the 2025 study suggests that up to 75% of present-day Egyptian ancestry traces back to groups related to the Nuwayrat individual and Neolithic North Africans. This is not a population replacement narrative. This is a story of continuity. Continuity, layered admixture, each layer thin enough to miss in any single generation, thick enough to measure across millennia. The Coptic Christian population, roughly 10 to 15% of Egypt, shows a genetic profile that some researchers associate with a closer approximation of the pre-Islamic Egyptian population. A 2015 study by Dobon et al. Identified what they called a Coptic component, an ancestral genetic cluster that peaks among Copts, and that the authors described as potentially resembling the Egyptian population before the Arab conquest, without the later Arabian influence visible in other Egyptian groups. The Copts themselves have long maintained this connection. In their own Coptic language, they still call themselves the Egyptians, a word that derives from the same root as the country's name. But even this is contested. A 2020 allele frequency study found that Egyptian Muslims and Christians originate from the same ancestors. The difference is one of degree, proportions of later admixture, not of kind. And this is where the science meets its own limits. We have one whole genome from the Old Kingdom, 3 partial genomes from the Third Intermediate Period, 0 genomes from Upper Egypt, from the Delta, from the pre-dynastic era, from the Middle Kingdom, from the Amarna period. The genetic history of ancient Egypt is being reconstructed from a handful of data points spread across a civilization that lasted 3,000 years and stretched 1,000 kilometers along a single river. Gad, in Cairo, called the Nuwayrat study a significant milestone, but cautioned that one genome cannot represent the diversity of an entire civilization. The next phase of this work requires something that has been difficult to achieve: sustained collaboration between international labs and Egyptian institutions, sequencing genomes from multiple regions and periods, building the kind of population-level dataset that can replace speculation with evidence. That lab in Cairo, the one Gad supervises inside the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, did not exist when Peabo was sneaking around his supervisor's workspace at night in 1984, secretly cutting tissue from museum mummies. The sequencing technology that read the Nuwayrat tooth did not exist when Schuenemann was receiving mummy heads from German university storage rooms. The cytosine damage authentication method that separates genuine ancient DNA from modern contamination did not exist when the field was ready to declare Egyptian mummy genomics dead. The man in the ceramic pot waited 123 years between excavation and sequencing. He may have been a potter, someone who shaped wet clay with his hands every day until his spine locked with arthritis and his sit bones flattened from years of crouching at a wheel. His DNA now shapes something else entirely. A picture of ancient Egypt that is neither purely African nor purely Near Eastern, but both, always both, in proportions that shifted with every millennium, every trade route, every empire that rose and fell along the river. Today, in a laboratory overlooking the Nile, Egyptian researchers are preparing to read the next genome. The ancestors are not silent. We just needed 40 years to learn how to listen.